Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's edition of Citizen Spotlight. I'm Tom Bonomi, and my guest tonight is John Luakkenan. John is a lifelong resident of Quincy. He was a Marine Corps veteran of World War II, served with the 6th Marine Division, and he is an author of a recent book that he's just published himself entitled Quincy Quarries, Gold and Gloom. So welcome to the show tonight, John.
Thank you, Tom.
I'd like to start off. Did I get that right? You're a lifelong resident of West Quincy or Quincy?
Quincy, both south. I was born South Quincy.
South Quincy,
yeah.
Okay. And you have a very interesting story of the night you were born. It was New Year's Eve?
Yeah, it was December 31st, 1919, and a group of Finnish immigrants went to my parents' home to celebrate New Year's Eve. And about an hour before New Year's Eve, midnight, I arrived to join the party.
No kidding.
With the aid of a midwife who happened to be at the party.
So you were the life of the party that night.
I have been partying ever since.
Really, every New Year's Eve is very special because it's your birthday, so you must really enjoy it.
Yes,
every
sir.
New Year's. So tell me a little bit about growing up in Quincy. For instance, what did your father do for work? I understand.
Well, actually, growing up during the 20s, the roaring 20s, of course, it was a very good time because everybody was working. Everybody was making money, and my father ran a milk delivery business on President's Hill in Quincy and made enough money to send all the kids down to Finnish camp down in Furnace Pond in Pembroke. And he would join us on the weekends all the time. And then, of course, the Depression hit. A law was passed requiring the pasteurization of milk, and he couldn't afford the money to buy the equipment. So the business was sold to Wright Brothers Milk Company. Oh. And he went to work for Swingle's Quarry at that time.
He did work at Swingle's Quarry, and they just had a picture up there of the quarry where he was working probably around that time earlier. So now your mother, was she just a housewife, or did she work?
No, she also worked. There was a doctor down in Furnace Brook Parkway who had a hospital, and she ran the laundry for his hospital there.
Oh. Now, as a kid growing up in Quincy, did you swim up the quarries?
I think we swam in almost every one of the quarries at one time or another. We were constantly going up there.
So you remember a lot of the stories of different things that happened up there at the time.
Yeah.
I know there were a lot of cars that were dumped in the quarries in those days.
Yes.
And one particular story that was in your book, I remember, was very, very interesting. There was a gangster, but there was a car dumped in the quarry, and you as a kid saw this?
Yes, actually, I lived on Smith Street in Quincy at that time, and a fellow named Eddie Lindblom lived in the same four-family home. And we went up to Jerf's Quarry for an early morning swim. And when we got there, we saw tire tracks going into the quarry and bushes along the edge of the tire tracks which were freshly broken. So immediately we ran down to Brewer's Corner, and there was always a policeman on duty 24 hours a day down there. We told him what we saw, and he called the station. We ran back up, and then we just stood there in awe when the detectives arrived, because one of them measured the tire track and said, "That's an Essex." And
you could tell from the width of the tire track.
We couldn't believe that. So they hired a diver then. His name was Fred Wallace from Somerville. And of course he, at that time, wore the canvas suit with the bulbous head cap and lead belt and lead shoes and everything else, and we'd never seen anything like that before. He went down and located the car, and they lowered a cable down and he hooked it up, and they pulled the car up, and sure enough it was an Essex, and it was bullet-ridden, and inside was a fellow named Red Curran from South Boston, who had been murdered.
Gangster.
Now 15 years passed, and they could never solve that murder, and to this date it has not been solved.
So that was really interesting, being a kid and seeing something like that. I remember I grew up in West Quincy, and I was around the quarries. I was a quarry rat. I was up there all the time. And, you know, a lot of the same thing. Cars were being dumped up there all the time. But now, your era, there were quarries that were still being worked, but there were also quarries that people were swimming in that were abandoned. And earlier they brought up a graphic, but I have the magazine. You probably remember this magazine. I'm going to hold it up for the camera to see.
Right.
That's Life magazine. From 1938, I think, or 1939.
38 is correct.
38. and there's a bunch of guys up there, kids, and one of them, I believe, is my father. He's one of the ones sitting down there about in the middle. I don't know, I can't verify it, but I know other people in West Quincy that have actually picked out people in that picture. So in those days, there were a lot of problems up there, but
Sure.
it didn't seem to be as bad as it became in recent years. And we're going to get into that in a little bit because that's what your book is about. But I want to talk a little bit more about your life. And I know that you grew up in Quincy and you worked down the shipyard.
But prior to that, actually, as a kid going to high school, for the 3 summers in my senior year, I worked down at the Nantasket Beach, working in the kitchen, washing dishes for the Seabreeze Cafe, which was run by the Callis family who lived in Bates Avenue in West Quincy.
That's my street.
Right. And
The Callis family?
yeah, and they ran that, and it was a wonderful place to work. They were great. Mr. Callis took us youngsters in to see the Boston Red Sox play once every summer, and we lived on the beach actually during that time.
That must have been great.
It was quite an experience. In fact, I'm suffering now by cancer on the nose.
There's so much sun down there.
Yes, right.
Well, that was a different era altogether down there, too. There wasn't
Yeah.
as much traffic. People weren't fighting for parking spots and all
No,
that.
no.
You also worked at the shipyard.
Yeah, then after I graduated from high school, the first job I had then, I drove an express truck.
Okay.
And it was called the Quincy Electric Express. The name is strange because it had originally been the Eastern Massachusetts Street Railway freight line, which ran from Boston to Braintree. And they sold it to a fellow named Donnelly, who lived in Marymount, and he kept the name for the reputation. And I worked with him for 3 years before I went to work in the shipyard. I started in the shipyard first working in the steel mill as a rigger, and I pitched for the steel mill softball team. We won every game except the last one, and the truck drivers union beat us 1-0 in the yard championship. Then I took a course on running a plate planer, and there were 2 machines in the old boiler shop, and I worked there. And then they built a new turret shop and put new machinery in there, and we moved over to there. And I worked there, and I was working there. I had a planer that was cutting the face plates on the 16-inch guns for the USS Massachusetts.
Wow.
And those plates were then assembled and locked together.
You can still get down there and see your work today, then. Well, you can't
Yeah.
see it. It's probably buried.
Yeah, it's buried.
The gun mounts, but it's
But
still there.
then about 5 o'clock one morning while I was working a night shift, we rotated 3 shifts, 6 months at a time. And I was on the night shift and we heard a bugle blow. And so we all shut our machines and ran out because we knew it was time for the Massachusetts to leave. And it was quite an awesome sight because as we got outside, the entire rails of the Massachusetts were lined with sailors in their white uniforms. And the Marine unit was marching up the gangway at that time with the bugles playing the Marine hymn and so forth. So it was quite a sight. And then slowly she was pulled out by the tugs and we watched her leave.
Now, when did you got married first before you went into the service? And
Yes, I got married on June 6, 1942, to a girl named Dot Raleigh, who lived on Cranch Street. And in fact, it was her father that got me the job in the shipyard. He had worked for the original engine company before it was the shipyard even. And
Four River Engine.
Yeah, and he was a lifelong worker there and had good connections and got me the job.
Did you have a chance to get a deferment because you were working at the shipyard?
Yes, I did for a year. And then, even though I was married by then, and I figured, well, I'm got a cushy job, but they needed more and more help, and all of a sudden I got the word, you're drafted. And a whole bunch of us from West Quincy went in together in the Boston, in the Federal Building, And for 3 hours we got poked, pinched, and photographed, and urine samples, the whole bit. And then when that was all over, then you had to go up to the top floor where the recruiting officers were. But by that time, hanging around for 3 hours, I wanted to get out of there. So the guy says, come on, we're going in the Army. So we looked over there, and there was a line, a block long, waiting to get to the recruiting sergeant. Yeah, I'm not going to stand in that line. So I looked over to the Navy, another long line. I looked over to the Marine Corps. And there was the Marine sergeant with his feet up on the desk reading a comic book. That's for me. I joined the Marine Corps.
You thought that was what you were going to be doing during the whole military. So you enlisted, not drafted. You enlisted and went.
Well, yeah, you got drafted. The draft board called you first,
yeah,
and then you were discharged and enlisted in the Marine Corps. But it was the Marine Corps Reserve, and it was under the term DOE, or during emergency. In other words, once the war was over, you could get out. You didn't serve a 4-year hitch in that sense.
Well, I neglected to mention one other thing, like when you were growing up before you went into the service. Well, you actually did this drawing afterwards.
Yes, in fact, I just did that about a month or so ago.
You did that a month ago. You're an artist, too, on top of everything else. But that was from your days of growing up. I don't remember that, but that was the Echo Bridge. I've heard about it.
Yes.
West Quincy.
On Furnace Brook Parkway in West Quincy, yes.
So
I just added the train to it to put it back into the 1800s when it was the old Colony Railroad.
Yep.
It is now the expressway.
I've heard many people talk about that bridge, but I've never seen it before until I went up to your house and I saw it. All right, getting back to a little bit now, you were in the Marine Corps and you went to boot camp.
Yeah.
And then you were sent overseas. You went to the Pacific.
Yeah, actually I went to Chicago for some more training in school there, and then went to the West Coast. And I was on the West Coast for about 6 months, actually. It was involved in two things. First of all, the Marine Corps was going to train a group of Army officers for Pacific duty. And so we were a communications outfit. I was in a JASCO, which is a Joint Assault Signal Company. And we got a group of Army officers, captains, majors, lieutenants, the whole bit. And it was pretty good to have a private bossing around a bunch of officers for a change. And so we spent months, and we went through a complete landing operation showing them how the Marines landed on the different islands and everything else and what their duties would be as officers. And they threw us quite a nice beer bust after it was all over. And then I worked for a short while with the 5th Marine Division, which was on in Camp Pendleton at that time. And they were moving their headquarters to Hawaii.
Yep.
And we set up 2 telephone poles with wires in between for communication set up between Hawaii and Pendleton. And then I got shipped overseas.
In that period of time is, I believe I read it, you have a diary here, right?
Yes.
That you made up? You had a scrapbook. They had shown up a picture of the scrapbook earlier, but this diary, I wonder if we can get a shot of that. Can you hold it up for the camera? This is something that your daughter asked you to put together, this diary. It's a diary that you kept, a daily diary from World War II.
Right.
When you went overseas. And what was the reason that you kept the diary?
Well, actually, once I got aboard ship and we got outside of the land, and I thought, well, gee, I'm a fatalist. I don't know whether I'll come back. Nobody does. And I'm sure that my wife and my child, which we were expecting at that time, would like to have some information. So our church, Bethany Congregational Church in Quincy, gave each one of us a small Bible that I read one page each day whenever I had a chance, morning, noon, or night. And in doing so, I wrote on the periphery of every page, I should be able to take that, okay. I don't know
I
if
think
you
our camera can get a shot of that.
if
Sure,
you
hold it
can
up.
see that or not, but
You can zoom in on it and get a tighter shot. You might not be able to read it. But your pastor gave you that, and you wrote on every single page?
every single page, actually, around the periphery, I wrote what I considered the important events of that particular day. We were not supposed to do this, of course. It was illegal. But I tried to write it in such a way that if it was ever caught by anybody, it wouldn't do any damage or anything like that. And when I got home, I left that and put it away. I'd forgotten it altogether until my children came to me and said, "Dad, how about writing something for us?" And so I took this diary then and wrote this particular book. And
very interesting.
That's
You
it.
gave me a copy of it, and I've read the day-to-day activities that you went through. I believe it was April Fool's Day. You landed on Okinawa.
that is correct.
You must remember that day like it was yesterday.
It was Sunday, it was Easter Sunday, it was D-Day, all in one. Yeah.
Now, you started drawing back there when you were in Okinawa. You actually
I started drawing when we were down on Guadalcanal.
Guadalcanal.
The 6th Marine Division was formed on Guadalcanal, not in the campaign, but after it was secure. And we did all our training down there, all different units brought together, and then we sailed for Okinawa. But while I was down there, after a couple of days, there wasn't any news that you could write home about, because it was either the sun or it was rain, the beach and the water, and that was it. So I decided that I would draw pictures of wherever I was at the time and include it with a letter to my wife.
One of them was, I think they can bring it up, and it was, I think you drew one of your shower. Was that?
That was on Okinawa. After we'd been on the OP for a while, we came back to the beach.
Yep.
And we built a shower there.
They have the chapel up now.
Okay, the chapel, we were told that we were going to get a minister for the first time on the island. And so we scurried around and got all the scrap material that we could find, and we built a small chapel, which I drew a picture of. And we received a minister who was one of these hellfire brimstone Texans, Baptist ministers, huge man, about 6'8", broad shoulders, and with a real stentorian voice. I'm sure the Japanese heard him when he preached that day to us. And then he said one thing. He says, "Gentlemen, I have a hobby. Before I die, I hope that I can baptize somebody in every sea and ocean in the world. I don't have one in the East China Sea, where we were on the coast there. Can I get a volunteer?" So 2 Texas boys volunteered. He picked them each up by the collar, and as big and strong as he was, he raised them off the ground, and he waded out to the ocean and dunked them several times and then pulled them back out again, and thanked everybody for allowing him to christen somebody in the East China Sea.
One story that I read in your diary, which I thought was really interesting, you'll remember, was you wanted to bring back a present for your wife, Dot, and you went to this Chinese...
Oh, that's after the war was over. We went to, our unit went to Tsingtao, China, and we were there to repatriate the Japanese forces and see that they got aboard ship to go back to Japan. And we had a lot of free time, and I liked walking around town. And I walked into a store, and I saw that through the window a beautiful blue and white porcelain dinner set. And so I went into the store and asked the gentleman there how much it cost. And he said, "Well, it's $150. Well, I'm making $50 a month. I said, that's too much for me, and I started to walk out. He says, "No, wait a minute." He says, he spoke excellent English, by the way, even though he was Chinese. And he said, "Well," he says, "for a Marine," he said, "I'll make it $125. I said, "Well, that's still too much." I said, "I'll give you $50. I figured a month's pay is more than enough.
Sure.
And he says, "No." So I backed out of this store and thanked him first time. He said, "Wait a minute, would you like a cup of tea?" So I said, yes, I would. So we went into the back room. He had a little black iron stove there with a teapot on the top of it. And we sat down and we solved all the problems of the world. Had a wonderful conversation. And as I left, he says, would you please come back? And he says, I'll make that $100. And I says, thank you. And I went back, and actually I visited him 3 or 4 times. And each time he come down, and he finally come down to $75. And I says, well, I guess he won't come any lower than that, and I'll try and scrape the money up. Probably get in a poker game somewhere. And we're sitting there having a cup of tea and celebrating the fact that I got it, and the doorbell rang, and he excused himself, and a naval officer walked in. And I could hear him talking, and he said, how much is that set in the window? And the old Chinese said, $150. Wrap it up. I want to send it back to America to my wife.
Wow.
Well, I didn't get it. So he came back, shaking his head, and I said, well, you got your money. Well, he said, if I'd known he was going to buy the first number, he said, I'd have asked for more. So he was disappointed, even though he got his 150. So then he turned around and he said, look, is there anything else you'd like here? Well, he had a wonderful bolt of white silk. And I said, gee, my wife loves to sew. I says, I'd like to buy that. How much is it? He says, it's free. He says, you take that home to your wife and have her sew a dress for the daughter which you have never seen yet. And so I thanked him very much. Put it in my sea bag. And when we went back to the States, we had to stop in San Diego and take our sea bags and lay them out on the dock for everybody to inspect, make sure we didn't have any material in there.
Weapons.
We weren't supposed to have weapons and so forth, especially samurai swords.
Yep.
And then they told us, okay, you can come back, get your sea bags. When I got my sea bag, the silk was gone.
Wow.
Never found out who took it, never got it.
Do you have the picture of your wife and your daughter? Your daughter was born when you were overseas.
Yes,
And you didn't
yes,
see it
she
until you
was.
got home.
Well, I have a picture which my wife sent me. In fact, she was, I kept getting letters from her talking about the baby, the baby. I didn't even know it was a boy or a girl or anything.
Yep. Could I see it?
And I had this, finally I got this picture of my wife and my daughter, and it was my daughter's first Christmas. I got it actually in February of that following year.
You've had it ever since.
Yes, in fact, it's a little dilapidated and everything because I carried it in my pocket, and when we landed on Okinawa, we had to wade in, and it got soaking wet, and then I laminated it after I got home.
So that was the daughter you didn't see. That's your oldest daughter.
She was, yes, she was a month short of 2 years old when I got home and saw her for the first time.
Wow. That's great. Now, you came home from the war.
Yeah.
And I guess you probably took the GI Bill, right? You did some...
Yeah, actually, first job I had, I worked for a bank in Boston. And I worked there for about a year and a half, and then was told that I had reached my maximum earning because I didn't have a college education and so forth, and they wanted people with degrees to advance. And so I left. I got a job with the Hathaway Bakeries in Brockton, and inside of a year I was making twice what I had made when I was working for the bank, so I was happy there. But in order to work there, you had to train by walking the streets for 6 months, carrying a loaf of bread on another man's territory and getting him new customers so that you would know how to sell the bread. And in July of this one year, it was about 100 degrees that day, one of those real July hot days. And it got to be about 4 o'clock, and I was pooped. It was a terrible day. I had one more house, and then I was supposed to meet the salesman for that territory, and he'd take me back to the barn. I knocked on the door, and the door opened, and there a huge man in a T-shirt and shorts with a beer in his hand looked at me and says, "Get around to the back door, you peddler." And I looked at him, and I didn't give a darn at that point. And I held that loaf of bread up, and I said, you know, this is such a darn good loaf of bread, it rates the front door entrance. He looked at me, how'd you like a beer? In the house I went, and he became the best customer that salesman had. He bought nothing but cakes and pies, no bread.
So, I also wanted to ask, like, you started writing on the ship going overseas. You wrote part of the newspaper there.
That was another one of those deals, you know. I was a goof-off all the time. I looked for a way out of getting out of work, you know, most of the time. And I heard they were going to have a ship's newspaper.
Heave-ho.
And we named it the Heave-ho.
Yep.
The heading showed the words actually, each letter was a figure of a person bending over, heaving.
Yep.
And we wrote...
sick on the ship?
Yeah, we put out 3 editions before we got down to Guadalcanal on that.
Yep.
I still have the 3 original editions at home.
Yep. Then you also wrote some different pamphlets, I guess.
Well, after the bakery went broke, it actually was sold to Bond Bread, and they had their own salesman, so they got rid of us. And one of the bakers who got laid off with me had a brother who worked for Abrasive Products in Braintree, and he said they're looking for people to work. So I went over there and I got a job. And it didn't pay as much as I made as a baker for a while, but I advanced, and I ended up as a vice president of manufacturing of Abrasive Products. Then we were bought out by Michigan, and then I got in charge of 3 plants: Braintree, Massachusetts, Detroit, Michigan, and Florence, Alabama. And during that time, I started writing information books, quality control, and so forth. So this is one booklet here. I wrote at Abrasive Products, and it is the history of abrasive industry. And it's for salesmen to give as gifts to customers and so forth. Mm-hmm. And then Michigan Abrasive bought Abrasive Products, and then Michigan folded, and I went to work for Clipper Abrasives. And at Clipper Abrasives, I wrote another booklet for them. And in this one, with the help of the salesman collecting them for me, I got samples from every abrasive manufacturer in the world. And I took each one of their items and what they called it and what grid it was and what size and what the backing was and so forth, and compared it to our product, Clipper's product. And this way the salesman could go into any plant around the country and say, well, oh, you're using Chinese 400 silicon carbide. This is our product that match it, and we can deliver it tomorrow, and you've got to wait for it to come from China. And so that also helped the salesman.
Oh. So that all led up to you writing, this is your first book that you've published here.
Yeah.
Quincy Quarries, Gold in Gloom.
That actually, I was attending a book signing at Barnes & Noble in Braintree, Mass., where Dr. Fitzgerald, a director of the Quincy Historical Society, had a book signing. And we listened to him, and he's a wonderful speaker. He seems to have the entire history of Quincy all in his head, and he can talk for hours on end. And when it was all over, several of us stayed behind to talk with him and so forth. And during the course of the conversation, he mentioned that the Historical Society did not have a complete history of all the drownings in the quarries. And he said, John, if you got some spare time, maybe you'd like to write about it. So I spent the next 3 years in the library and at the Historical Society and talking to various other people and writing this book on the quarries, Gold and Gloom, the gold being that part where the various buildings around the world and monuments were built of Quincy granite. And then the gloom with the drownings, murders, suicides, and so forth of 51 people that I was able to verify.
Well, we'll talk a little bit about the golden years. I know we're going over our time, but came out of that quarry, and they'll bring up some graphics, some pictures here as we talk about them. And I'll mention a couple of them, like the Customs House building, which everybody knows in Boston. That was built out of Quincy granite.
Yes.
That's one of them. Everybody knows the First Parish Church was another one that was the columns came from Quincy, the Rattlesnake Quarry in Quincy. That was an early example. City Hall, the Customs House, as we mentioned. There's also the granite ball that you see at the shipyard, and there's another one that's located down the cemetery.
Yes.
All this was Quincy granite.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it was really one of the thriving industries of the time, I guess,
Yeah.
here in Quincy. That and the shipyard was what drove the economic engine of this city at one time.
In fact, the first building that was ever made entirely of granite was made with Quincy granite. That was in the country. And that was King's Chapel
King's Chapel, yep.
on Tremont Street.
Yep.
Yeah.
They also had the Granite Railway, and there's part of that Granite Railway that's still not that far from my house. It's at the end of Mullen Ave, and there's tablets there that depict the railway cars on the railway, and that railway was built specifically to haul the granite for the Bunker Hill Monument.
Right.
1826, and I think the Bunker Hill Monument was probably one of the first prefab granite buildings built at that time too. So there's a lot of history there. The quarries really made a lot of people rich and put a lot of bread on everybody's table. Your father worked at Swingles. My grandfather was in the granite industry.
And it made Quincy worldwide famous.
Yep, and you touched on that in your book. Part of the book is about that, naturally. The other part of the book, the sad part, is the gloom, which refers to the drownings that you have documented there, and
Yes.
you put them in chronological order in your book.
Right.
And
Yeah,
I know you witnessed one of them in particular way back in the 1950s, the Matson story. Could you just tell us a little bit about that one?
Well, I think the Matson story is the one that actually was in the eye of the country for the longest period of any drowning. In fact, it was actually 1 month short of 2 years. It was constantly in the headlines. Little Danny Matson was out playing, and his dad came, made his lunch. His mother was working. His dad made lunch for him and went out and called him back in for lunch. And the boy had been playing with his dog. He was nowhere in sight. So the father went around to various neighbors asking if they'd seen little Danny. Nobody did, so they all joined with him, and they ran up the quarry, which was only about 1,200 feet away from the house, off Cranch Street, Field and Wild Quarry, actually, and they looked around there, but there was no sign of the boy, and all of a sudden the dog came back home, but without the boy. Well, they called the police then, and notified them that little Danny was missing, and search started. And of course, papers wrote it up, and the usual crazies came on the radio or wrote letters saying, oh, Danny's all right, well, we'll be talking to you about money, about a ransom, and Danny's living down in Florida with the family and he's well taken care of, and all these stories which turned out to be not true. And the father was certain that he had been kidnapped, and he wanted the FBI in there and everything. Well, they came with dogs, and they tried to find him. Nowhere could they track him. But one dog did go to the Field and Wild Quarry, but they had looked there, and they didn't see the boy, so they didn't do anything about that. It was about almost 2 years, and Chief Hughes of the Quincy Police Department had a friend who lived down outside of Richmond, Virginia, and he talked about an animal down in Richmond. It was a 29-year-old horse called Lady Wonder, and this horse answered questions, and he thought, this is crazy, but
Nobody would believe it.
no, and so he said to his friend, look, I'm going to give you 5 questions, and if the horse can answer those 5 questions, ask him where Danny Matson is. Well, the way the horse answered questions, they had huge blocks with all the letters of the alphabet. And when he was to answer a question, with his nose, he would touch the individual letters of the alphabet and spell out the words for his answer. So he answered all 5 questions correctly. And the man said, "Where's Danny Matson?" And the horse answered, "Pittsfield." Well, we have a Pittsfield in western Massachusetts. So immediately, Ferrazzi had now become chief. Hughes had retired. And so Ferrazzi sent Corbett, Sergeant Corbett, I believe his name was, out to Pittsfield to check on that. But he couldn't find anything. He come back and said, no, there's no record of it. So time dragged on, and Ferrazzi was one of those nights when it was miserable. He couldn't sleep. He was tossing and turning and so forth. And all of a sudden he had an idea. It sounds crazy, but you know, Pittsfield, a pit could be a quarry. Field could be field and wild quarry. So maybe the horse meant field and wild quarry. So he called up the district attorney Dewey at that time and told him about it. He said, "I know it's crazy," he says, "but I really think that boy is in field and wild quarry." So he said, "You know, I agree with you. I'm going to issue an order to have that quarry drained. But don't tell anybody about the horse. They'll think we're crazy."
And that was way back in the 1950s.
50s, yes.
Today, people would probably say, well, that's not such a crazy thing, but back then, nobody would, the police department wouldn't be associated with it. I also read in your book, it's really interesting because I know that you went to the library and you researched this and you mostly got a lot of old newspaper stories. And when you go back and you read these historical stories about how they searched for people that were drowned in the quarries in those days, there was one instance about a young kid, he was only 17 years old, and the police actually let him dive to search for a body at one time?
His name was Smith, I believe, and it was a young Marjorie Laukkenan, her name was. And she, actually there was a young fellow that had built a kayak, out of wood and canvas and so forth, and the kids were all playing with it in field and wild quarry once again. And it got to be about supper time, and they were all going home for supper. And the kid that had built the boat said, "Look, don't touch the boat. Margie stayed there yet." So apparently the minute he left, she got aboard the boat, and for nobody knows how or why, it tipped over, and she fell in. And this fellow named Smith, who was crippled, one arm was bent, and the leg was twisted, and he limped, and he heard her scream. So he ran to the nearest house and told them to call the police, and he went in and he dove several times, but he couldn't find the girl. The police arrived, and they dragged for a while, and their drags kept snagging, because as we know, everything, including the kitchen sink, was always thrown into these quarries. So their drag nets would stick on automobiles or some other piece of junk down there. And then Mayor Bergen came to the scene and said, "Don't waste any more time, I'm going to hire a diver." The diver came and in a few minutes found her body. She had drowned.
Yep, so much debris in those quarries. Yeah. Now the quarries have been drained. The last couple of drownings they had the last kid, I guess, Christopher Griffiths, was drowned up in Swingle's Quarry. He fell into Swingle's Quarry and got killed. Yeah. They just had it up on the monitor a little bit earlier. Some of the video there, the kids would go up there and they'd actually put memorials up there of their friends when they were lost. All the quarries have been drained because of that, and they're being filled, or they have been filled.
And not all of them, though.
That's true. There's a couple that are still left.
We have 2 up in what is now become
the golf course.
The golf course.
Yeah.
And there's Fuller's Quarry and Goldfish Quarry, who are remaining as hazards for the golf course.
Right.
And by the way, speaking of that, took a walk up there the other day, and of course they got some wonderful ball fields up there for the kids.
They do, and that's what they've converted some of the quarries into, and I think we even have a picture of one of them. That was on Cashman's Quarry. That's up behind
yes, right.
And it's getting a good workout.
Now, these quarries have not been, these ball fields have not been named yet. And usually they name them for politicians or people like that. And I thought, wouldn't it be a nice idea if we took those 4 ball fields and named them for the 4 quarries in that area as a memorial? Cashman's Quarry, Badger's Quarry, Swingle's Quarry, and the Granite Rail.
Yep.
And if we named each of those ballparks for those quarries, it would become a memorial and people would remember the quarries.
Yeah, there's actually 4 Little League ball fields up there that Quarry Hills built, like you're talking about. And I don't think they have named them yet.
No.
We were up there the other day taking some pictures of them, and the kids are having a blast up there playing ball. It's amazing to think of that.
Yes.
They have this old quarry that's now been turned into a ballpark.
Right.
And it's great, really. Some of the other quarries are being used for climbing and other recreational uses. Well, I think we're towards the end of the show here, and what I wanted to cover was you self-published this book. You went through
Traffic Publishing in Victoria, British Columbia. Yes. You pay for the printing. They do, the reason I went for it, being new at the publishing business, and I hadn't done anything outside of, for different companies, nothing on my own, they do all the work for the publishing. They get you your ISBN number, they do all the research, they do all the printing, they go on the internet. In fact, this is on the internet worldwide right now. They publish it with the prices of, I think there are 4 different British and Russian and a few other figures.
So they give you a lot of support.
Absolutely. They do the advertising on that. They're on the internet. You can see the pictures from the book on the internet today and so forth. And then they also sell the book to, especially to like Barnes and Nobles and various book houses, and they collect the royalties, and quarterly they pay me the royalties which they sell the books for.
The last Citizen Spotlight we did was another fellow that wrote a book about the shipyard, and he did it the same way. He self-published the book. He had nothing but words of praise also, so it's a good outlet for somebody that really wants to, that has a story and they want to publish the story and they can get it out there.
Absolutely.
And do it. And I know that now you also have another little hobby before we close out the show, and you have a business card that you gave me, and Chasing Blondes, I believe.
Chasing Blondes, Brunettes, and Redheads after 65. What that is, actually, when my wife was living, she collected dolls. And she passed away almost 8 years ago now, and she left me with over 1,000 dolls. Now, what's a widower going to do with dolls?
Especially an ex-Marine.
And my oldest daughter came to me one day. She's a school nurse down in North Elementary School in Pembroke. And she said, "Dad, why don't you write up a story about Ma's collection and make a display rack and so forth, and come down and give the kids in my school a talk on dolls. They would enjoy it." So I did it. And 3 teachers who watched the show came to me afterwards and says, each one of them is a member of a women's club in their particular church, and said, "We would love to have you come to the women's club and do this." So as a result, I have done over 20 shows, Rice Eventide home here in Quincy, churches all over the South Shore, some senior citizens groups and so forth, and kids' school shows, and it's turned out to be quite a deal. In fact, at 5 o'clock today, before I came in, I got a telephone call from Christ Church in Quincy Square asking me to put on a show next October for them. So I'm still keeping busy on that angle.
So that's another thing that keeps you busy. That's great. Well, I think we've covered just about everything, John. Your final thoughts were you would like to see those ball fields named after the quarry owners.
That's the quarry,
and
right.
You talked to the city council about that, and we'll see what happens there, you know. It's great. I enjoyed having you in. It's very interesting. I want to thank you for coming in tonight and doing the show with me.
Well, I certainly want to thank you for the opportunity to advertise my book and to talk a little more than I expected to talk.
Oh, great. And once again, the name of the book is Quincy Quarries, Golden Gloom. And if you want more information about John or his book, you can go to Trafford Publishing. I think it's www.trafford.com. And you can find out more about his book. And thank you very much for tuning in tonight.